I never imagined my life could turn upside down in a matter of hours. It was just another Tuesday, or so I thought. The day had started like any other. I woke up at 6:30 a.m., kissed my husband John goodbye as he left for his business trip, and headed to work at the local publishing house where I'd been employed for the past 7 years. The day dragged on, filled with the usual tasks of editing manuscripts and attending team meetings. By 5 p.m., I was more than ready to head home, looking forward to a quiet evening with a good book and maybe a glass of wine. Little did I know that my plans, and indeed my entire life, were about to be dramatically altered. As I pulled into our driveway at 5:45 p.m., I noticed something odd. There was an unfamiliar car parked in front of our house, a sleek, silver Mercedes that I'd never seen before. My first thought was that perhaps John had come home early from his trip and rented a fancy car as a surprise. It wouldn't be unlike him. He'd always had a flair for the dramatic. With a mix of curiosity and excitement, I hurried to the front door, fumbling with my keys. As I pushed the door open, the sight that greeted me was so surreal that for a moment, I thought I must have walked into the wrong house. There, sitting regally on our plush beige sofa, was my mother-in-law, Barbara. Now, Barbara's presence itself wasn't entirely shocking. She'd visited us before, though always with advance notice. What made this scene so bizarre was the mountain of luggage surrounding her. Suitcases of various sizes were stacked neatly around the living room, giving the impression that she was moving in rather than visiting. "Barbara?" I managed to stammer, my brain struggling to process the scene before me. "What's going on? Is everything okay?" Barbara, a woman in her early 60s with perfectly coiffed silver hair and an ever-present pearl necklace, slowly rose from the sofa. Her face, usually warm and welcoming, was set in a stern expression that sent a chill down my spine. "Sarah," she said, her voice unnervingly calm, "I'm glad you're home. We need to talk." I stood frozen in the doorway, my work bag still slung over my shoulder, keys dangling forgotten in my hand. "Talk about what? Where's John? Did something happen?" Barbara's eyes narrowed slightly, and she took a step towards me. "John is fine, as far as I know. But that's not why I'm here." My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. Had there been a fire at Barbara's house? A break-in? Was she in some kind of trouble and needed a place to stay? None of these scenarios explained the coldness in her voice or the hardness in her eyes. "I don't understand," I said, finally stepping fully into the house and closing the door behind me. "What's with all the luggage? Are you moving in?" A small, humorless smile played at the corners of Barbara's lips. "In a manner of speaking, yes. But not in the way you're thinking." My heart began to race, a sense of foreboding creeping over me. "Barbara, please, you're scaring me. What's going on?" She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and delivered the words that would shatter my world. "As of today, this is my house. You have until tomorrow to pack your things and leave." The room seemed to spin around me. I gripped the back of a nearby chair to steady myself, certain I must have misheard. "What? That's impossible. This is our house, mine and John's. We've lived here for 5 years. Barbara's expression remained impassive. "Not anymore. I have the deed right here." She gestured to a folder on the coffee table. "This house now belongs to me, and I'm exercising my right to live in it." I felt as though I'd stepped into some kind of twisted alternate reality. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a joke, a terrible, misguided prank. "Barbara, this isn't funny. You can't just come in here and claim our house. Where's John? I need to talk to him." "John is aware of the situation," Barbara replied coolly. "He agreed to this arrangement." My legs gave out, and I sank into the chair I'd been gripping. John had agreed to this. It didn't make any sense. We'd bought this house together, planned our future in it. How could he just give it away without even talking to me? "I don't believe you," I whispered, tears beginning to form in my eyes. "There has to be some mistake. Please, Barbara, tell me what's really going on." For a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something, regret? Sadness? In Barbara's eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced once again by that steely resolve. "There's no mistake, Sarah. I'm sorry it had to happen this way, but the facts are the facts. This house is mine now, and I need you to leave. I sat there, stunned into silence, as the reality of the situation began to sink in. My mother-in-law, a woman I'd shared holidays with, who'd hugged me and called me daughter, was kicking me out of my own home. And apparently, my husband had allowed it to happen. I don't understand, I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. Why are you doing this? Where am I supposed to go? Barbara's voice softened slightly, but her words remained firm. Where you go is not my concern. I suggest you start packing and make arrangements. You have until tomorrow evening. With that, she turned and walked towards the kitchen, leaving me sitting there, shell-shocked and confused. I watched as she moved around the space as if she already owned it, opening cupboards and examining their contents. I don't know how long I sat there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind kept replaying Barbara's words, searching for some hidden meaning, some explanation that would make this all make sense. But there was none to be found. As the shock began to wear off, it was replaced by a growing sense of panic. I needed to talk to John, to understand what was happening. With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone and dialed his number. It went straight to voicemail. John, I said, my voice cracking, I don't know what's going on, but your mother is here, and she's saying the house is hers now. Please call me back as soon as you get this. I'm scared, John. I need you. As I ended the call, I looked up to see Barbara standing in the doorway, watching me with an unreadable expression. Our eyes met, and for a moment, I thought I saw a glimmer of the woman I'd known for the past 5 years, the woman who'd welcomed me into her family, who'd shared recipes and life advice, who'd been more like a second mother than a mother-in-law. But then her expression hardened once again, and she spoke in a voice that left no room for argument. I suggest you start packing, Sarah. Tomorrow we'll be here before you know it. With that, she turned and walked up the stairs, leaving me alone in what had, just hours ago, been my living room. Now, surrounded by Barbara's luggage and the echoes of her ultimatum, it felt more like a stranger's house, a place where I no longer belonged. As the reality of my situation truly began to sink in, I felt a wave of emotions wash over me: confusion, fear, anger, betrayal. But most of all, I felt an overwhelming sense of loss. In the span of a few short minutes, my entire world had been turned upside down, and I had no idea how to write it again. As the initial shock began to wear off, I felt a surge of determination coursing through my veins. This was my home, damn it, and I wasn't about to let anyone, not even my mother-in-law, take it away from me without a fight. With shaky legs, I stood up from the chair I'd been rooted to and made my way towards the stairs. Barbara? I called out, my voice stronger than I felt. We need to talk about this. Now. I heard movement from upstairs, and a moment later, Barbara appeared at the top of the staircase. She looked down at me with an expression that was part annoyance, part resignation. There's nothing to discuss, Sarah, she said, her tone clipped. I've already explained the situation. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. No, you haven't. You've made demands, but you haven't explained anything. This is my home, mine and John's. We've lived here for 5 years. You can't just waltz in and claim it as your own. Barbara descended the stairs slowly, her hand trailing along the banister. I understand this is difficult for you, but the fact remains that I now own this house. The legal documents are all in order. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, I noticed she was holding a folder, the same one she had gestured to earlier. My heart raced as I eyed it, wondering what kind of document could possibly give her the right to our home. Show me, I demanded, holding out my hand. If you have some sort of legal claim to our house, I want to see it. For a moment, Barbara hesitated, and I thought she might refuse. But then, with a small sigh, she handed over the folder. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, dreading what I might find inside. The document on top was indeed a deed to the house, but what made my blood run cold was the name on it, Barbara Thompson. My mother-in-law's name was there in black and white, officially declaring her the owner of our home. This can't be real, I muttered, flipping through the pages. How is this possible? When did this happen? Barbara's voice was unnervingly calm as she replied, the transfer was completed last week. John signed over the deed to me. I felt as though I'd been punched in the gut. John? But, why? Why would he do that without telling me? That's between John and me, Barbara said, her tone leaving no room for further discussion on the matter. My mind was reeling. None of this made any sense. John and I had always made decisions about our home together. We'd spent countless hours discussing renovations, choosing paint colors, planning for our future in this very house. How could he have given it all away without even mentioning it to me? No, I said, shaking my head vehemently. No, I don't believe this. There has to be some mistake. I need to talk to John. I pulled out my phone again, desperately hoping that this time, John would answer. But once again, it went straight to voicemail. Frustration and fear battled within me as I left another message. John, please, I need you to call me back right away. Your mother is here with some kind of deed to our house. She's saying you signed it over to her. Please tell me this isn't true. I don't understand what's happening. Call me back, John. Please. As I ended the call, I looked up to see Barbara watching me with an expression that almost looked like pity. It only served to fuel my anger. I don't know what kind of game you and John are playing, I said, my voice shaking with emotion, but this is our home. We bought it together, we've built a life here. You can't just take that away. Barbara's expression hardened. I'm not playing any games, Sarah. The situation is what it is. I suggest you start accepting it and make arrangements to leave. I felt a surge of defiance. No. I'm not going anywhere. Not until I talk to John and figure out what's really going on here. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of uncertainty in Barbara's eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that same steely resolve. Fine, she said, her tone clipped. Stay if you must. But understand that this changes nothing. The house is mine now, and sooner or later, you will have to leave. With that, she turned and walked back upstairs, leaving me standing in the living room, clutching the folder with the deed and feeling more lost than ever. I sank back into the chair, my mind racing. There had to be an explanation for all of this. John wouldn't just give away our home without talking to me first. Would he? As much as I wanted to believe in my husband, a seed of doubt had been planted. Desperate for answers, I decided to try calling John one more time. This time, to my surprise and relief, he picked up on the third ring. Sarah. His voice sounded tired and slightly wary. What's going on? I've got a bunch of missed calls from you. The sound of his voice, usually a source of comfort, now filled me with a mix of relief and anger. What's going on? John, your mother is here. She's saying the house belongs to her now. That you signed it over to her. Please tell me this isn't true. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and my heart sank. When John finally spoke, his voice was hesitant and evasive. Sarah, listen, it's complicated. I can't really explain everything right now. I felt as though the floor had dropped out from under me. What do you mean, you can't explain? John, your mother is trying to kick me out of our home. I need you to tell me what's going on. I know, John said, his voice strained. Look, I'll be home in a couple of days. We can talk about everything then, okay? Just try to stay calm until I get back. Stay calm? I practically shouted into the phone. How am I supposed to stay calm when your mother is here with luggage, telling me I have to leave my own home? John, please, I need you to tell me what's happening. There was another long pause, and when John spoke again, his voice was low and defeated. Sarah, I'm sorry. I can't talk about this right now. We'll sort everything out when I get back, I promise. Just give me a couple of days, okay? Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stared at my phone in disbelief, feeling more confused and betrayed than ever. As the reality of the situation began to sink in, I felt a wave of emotions wash over me: anger, fear, confusion, and a deep, aching sense of betrayal. How could John do this to me? How could he give away our home without even discussing it with me? And why was he being so evasive now? I looked around the living room, taking in all the familiar details: the photos on the mantel, the throw pillows I'd picked out, the painting we'd bought on our honeymoon. Every inch of this house held memories, dreams, and plans for our future together. And now, in the blink of an eye, it all seemed to be slipping away. The sound of footsteps upstairs reminded me that I wasn't alone in my turmoil. Barbara was up there, probably unpacking her things, making herself at home in what she now considered her house. The thought made my blood boil. I stood up, a new determination filling me. I wasn't going to just sit here and let this happen. There had to be an explanation, and I was going to find it. If John wouldn't give me answers, I'd find them myself. With renewed purpose, I headed towards our home office. If there was any evidence of what was really going on, I'd find it there. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into a mystery, one where the stakes were higher than I could have ever imagined. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a series of revelations that would shake the very foundation of my life and everything I thought I knew about my marriage. With Barbara upstairs and John unreachable, I knew I had to take matters into my own hands. The home office had always been a shared space, but as I entered the room, it felt different somehow, as if I were trespassing in my own home. Pushing aside the unsettling feeling, I focused on the task at hand. I started with John's desk, methodically going through each drawer. Most contained the usual office supplies and random bits of paperwork, nothing out of the ordinary. But as I reached the bottom drawer, I found it locked. In 5 years of marriage, I'd never known John to lock anything away from me. The discovery sent a chill down my spine. Determined, I searched for the key, checking all the usual hiding spots. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, I found a small key taped to the underside of the desk. With trembling hands, I unlocked the drawer. Inside, I found a stack of documents that made my heart race. Bank statements, investment reports, and what looked like loan applications were neatly organized in folders. As I began to leaf through them, a pattern emerged that made my blood run cold. There were multiple transactions between John's personal account and Barbara's, large sums moving back and forth over the past 6 months. But what really caught my eye were the withdrawals, massive amounts taken out from our joint savings account, far more than we'd ever discussed. "What have you been up to, John?" I muttered to myself, feeling a mix of confusion and betrayal. As I dug deeper, I uncovered more troubling information. There were documents detailing investments in a company I'd never heard of, Apex Innovations. The paperwork showed John had poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into this venture, money I hadn't even known we had. My hands shook as I picked up another folder, this one labeled Property Holdings. Inside, I found the deed to our house, or rather, a copy of the original deed with both our names on it. Next to it was a new deed, the one Barbara had shown me earlier, transferring ownership solely to her name. The date on the transfer was just last week, coinciding with the start of John's business trip. "Oh, John," I whispered, feeling tears well up in my eyes. "What have you done?" But the revelations weren't over. At the bottom of the drawer, partially hidden under some old magazines, I found a plain manila envelope. Something told me this was important, and as I opened it, I realized just how right I was. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. As I spread them out on the desk, my world tilted on its axis. There was John, my husband, the man I thought I knew better than anyone in the world, in various compromising positions with another woman. The photos ranged from casual meetings in cafes to intimate moments in what looked like hotel rooms. The woman was beautiful, probably in her early 30s, with long dark hair and a dazzling smile. I felt physically ill as I flipped through the photos. Some were dated as far back as a year ago, others as recent as last month. The betrayal cut deep, each image another knife in my heart. "Sarah, what are you doing?" I jumped at the sound of Barbara's voice, whirling around to find her standing in the doorway. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene, the open drawer, the scattered documents, and the damning photos spread across the desk. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the air thick with tension. Then Barbara's expression changed, softening into something that looked almost like pity. "Oh, Sarah," she sighed. "You weren't supposed to find out like this." Her words snapped me out of my shock. "Find out? You mean you knew? You knew about all of this?" I gestured wildly at the mess on the desk. Barbara stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. "It's complicated, Sarah. John, he's made some mistakes." "Mistakes?" I echoed, my voice rising. He's been cheating on me, Barbara, for at least a year. And what about all this? I held up the financial documents. He's been moving money around, making investments I knew nothing about. And then there's the small matter of him giving you our house. How long have you known about all this? Barbara sank into the chair across from me, suddenly looking every bit her age. I only found out recently, about a month ago. John came to me, said he was in trouble. He needed help. What kind of trouble? I demanded, even as part of me dreaded the answer. Financial trouble, mostly, Barbara replied, her voice heavy. This company he invested in, Apex Innovations, it turned out to be a scam. John lost everything. Our savings, your savings, even took out loans he couldn't repay. The room seemed to spin around me as I processed this information. But the house. Why would he give you the house? Barbara's eyes met mine, and I saw a mix of sadness and determination in them. It was the only way to protect it. There are people after John, Sarah. People he owes money to. He signed the house over to me to keep it out of their reach. I felt as though I'd been plunged into ice water. People after him? What are you talking about, Barbara? Who's after John? She shook her head. I don't know all the details. John wouldn't tell me everything. He just said it was safer if I didn't know. My mind was reeling, trying to reconcile the John the first thought I knew with this new reality. The loving husband, the successful businessman. Had it all been a lie? And the woman? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper as I gestured to the photos. Did you know about her too? Barbara's silence was answer enough. I felt a fresh wave of betrayal wash over me. How could you not tell me? I demanded, anger rising to replace the shock. How could you let me go on believing everything was fine when you knew all of this? It wasn't my place to tell you, Sarah, Barbara replied, her voice firm despite the regret in her eyes. I hoped John would come clean, that he'd fix things before it came to this. I laughed bitterly. Fix things? How exactly was he planning to fix this, Barbara? He gave away our home, he's been cheating on me, he's apparently in debt to some dangerous people. What part of this is fixable? Barbara leaned forward, her expression earnest. Sarah, listen to me. I know this is a lot to take in, but we need to think practically now. John's in real trouble, and by extension, so are we. That's why I'm here, why I needed you to leave. It's not safe for you to stay here. Her words sent a chill down my spine. Not safe. Barbara, what aren't you telling me? How bad is this situation really? Before she could answer, we were startled by the sound of the front door slamming open downstairs. Heavy footsteps echoed through the house, accompanied by unfamiliar voices. Barbara's face paled. Oh no, she whispered. They've found us. Panic gripped me as I realized the gravity of the situation. Whatever trouble John had gotten himself into, it had just arrived at our doorstep. As the footsteps grew closer, I looked at Barbara, seeing my own fear reflected in her eyes. In that moment, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and my future had been built on a foundation of lies. And now, as unknown threats loomed just outside the door, I was faced with the terrifying reality that uncovering the truth might have put us all in danger. The sound of heavy footsteps climbing the stairs jolted Barbara and me into action. With surprising agility for her age, Barbara rushed to the office door and locked it, then turned to me with a finger pressed to her lips, signaling for silence. My heart pounded in my chest as the footsteps drew nearer. Who were these people? What did they want? And most importantly, what had John gotten us into? Mrs. Thompson? We know you're in there. Open up, we just want to talk. The voice was deep and authoritative, sending shivers down my spine. Barbara's face had gone pale, her usual composure cracking under the weight of fear. Sarah, she whispered, her voice barely audible, whatever happens, whatever you hear, remember that John loves you. He was trying to protect you. Before I could respond, a loud bang resonated through the room as something heavy slammed against the door. Barbara and I both jumped, stifling screams. Last chance, Mrs. Thompson. Open the door, or we're coming in. Barbara's eyes met mine, a silent apology in them. Then, to my shock, she straightened her shoulders and called out, all right. I'm opening the door. Just don't hurt anyone." As Barbara moved to unlock the door, I felt frozen in place, my mind racing with questions and fears. The door swung open, revealing two large men in dark suits. They looked more like businessmen than thugs, but the bulges under their jackets suggested they were armed. "Mrs. Thompson," the taller of the two men said, his eyes scanning the room before landing on me. "And you must be Sarah. Good, you're both here. We have some matters to discuss." Barbara stood her ground, her voice steadier than I would have expected. "Whatever business you have, it's with John, not us. We don't know anything." The man's lip curled in a humorless smile. "Oh, I think you know more than you're letting on, Mrs. Thompson. Your son has been very creative with our money. We're here to collect what's owed." As they stepped further into the room, I found my voice. "Who are you? What's going on?" The shorter man turned to me, his expression a mix of pity and annoyance. "Your husband, Mrs. Carter, has made some very poor financial decisions. He borrowed a significant amount of money from our organization, money he promised to repay with interest. Instead, he's been dodging our calls and moving assets around, including this house." My mind reeled as I tried to process this information. John, borrowing money from what was clearly some sort of criminal organization? It seemed impossible, so far removed from the man I thought I knew. "There must be some mistake," I said, my voice shaking. "John wouldn't. He's not that kind of person." The taller man laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "Oh, you'd be surprised what kind of person your husband is, Mrs. Carter. Did you know about his girlfriend? Or the gambling debts? Or the fact that he's been siphoning money from his company for months?" Each revelation felt like a physical blow. I looked to Barbara, hoping to see denial in her eyes, but found only resignation and guilt. "Barbara?" I whispered, pleading for her to tell me it wasn't true. She sank into a nearby chair, suddenly looking every bit her age. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I didn't know the full extent of it until recently. John came to me about a month ago, desperate for help. He said he'd made some bad investments, that he owed money to dangerous people. I thought if I could help him clear the debts, everything would be okay." The shorter man snorted. "Bad investments? Is that what he called it? Your son has a gambling problem, Mrs. Thompson. He's been hitting the casinos hard, trying to win back what he lost. Instead, he just dug himself deeper." I felt as though the floor had dropped out from under me. "The business trips," I murmured, pieces falling into place. "They weren't for work at all, were they?" Barbara shook her head, tears in her eyes. "No, they weren't. He'd go to Atlantic City, Las Vegas, anywhere he thought he could win big." "And the woman?" I asked, gesturing to the photos still scattered on the desk. "Who is she?" The taller man picked up one of the photos, examining it with a smirk. "Ah, yes. Melissa. She works for us, actually. Her job was to keep John entertained, and to make sure he kept borrowing more money." The casual way he spoke about my husband's infidelity made my blood boil. "So you set him up? Trapped him in this cycle of debt and deceit?" "Your husband trapped himself, Mrs. Carter," the man replied coldly. "We simply provided the opportunity. He's a grown man who made his own choices." Barbara stood up suddenly, her face set in determination. "Enough. What do you want? How much does John owe you?" The two men exchanged glances before the taller one spoke. "With interest and penalties, the debt currently stands at $2.3 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. How could John have gotten in so deep without me noticing? "We don't have that kind of money," I said weakly. "Oh, but you do," the shorter man replied with a predatory smile. "This house, for starters. And we know about the offshore account, Mrs. Thompson. The one your son set up in your name." Barbara's face paled. "How did you?" "We have our ways," he cut her off. "Now, here's how this is going to work. You're going to sign over this house to us. Then, you're going to transfer every penny from that offshore account. If you do that, we'll consider John's debt partially paid." "Partially?" I echoed, fear gripping me. What about the rest? The taller man's eyes gleamed. Well, that's where you come in, Mrs. Carter. Your husband may be in hiding, but we know he cares about you. You're going to help us find him. I felt sick to my stomach. And if I refuse? His smile was cold and threatening. Trust me, you don't want to refuse. We have ways of being very persuasive. As the gravity of the situation sank in, I felt a surge of anger, at John for his betrayal, at Barbara for her complicity, and at these men for their threats. But beneath the anger was a deep, aching sense of loss. The life I thought I had, the future I'd planned, it had all been built on lies. Barbara must have sensed my turmoil because she reached out and took my hand. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. I thought I was protecting you, protecting the family. I pulled my hand away, unable to find comfort in her touch. Protecting me? By lying to me? By trying to kick me out of my own home? I thought if you were gone, if there was nothing left here for them to take, they'd leave you alone, Barbara explained, her voice pleading. I was trying to give you a chance to start over, away from all this mess. The shorter man cleared his throat impatiently. As touching as this family drama is, we have business to conclude. Mrs. Thompson, if you'll come with us to make the necessary transfers. Mrs. Carter, you'll stay here with my colleague. Don't try anything foolish. As Barbara was led out of the room, she turned back to me, her eyes filled with tears. Sarah, whatever you think of me, of John, please know that everything we did out of love. We never meant to hurt you. With that, she was gone, leaving me alone with the taller man, my mind reeling from the revelations of the past few hours. As I sank into a chair, trying to process everything I'd learned, one thought kept circling in my mind: how well do we ever really know the people we love? The man watching me seemed to sense my turmoil. His voice, when he spoke, was surprisingly gentle. For what it's worth, Mrs. Carter, I believe your husband did love you. He just lost his way. I looked up at him, seeing a flicker of humanity behind his professional facade. Does that make any of this better? He shook his head slowly. No, I suppose it doesn't. But it might help you understand why he did what he did. As silence fell over the room, I found myself staring at the scattered photos and documents, physical evidence of the lies that had shattered my world. I realized that this was just the beginning of a long, painful journey, one that would force me to question everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and myself. As the hours ticked by, the reality of my situation began to sink in. Barbara had been gone for what felt like an eternity, presumably transferring funds and signing away our home. The man watching me, who had introduced himself as Mr. Reeves, maintained a stoic silence, occasionally checking his phone. Just when I thought I couldn't bear the tension any longer, the door opened, and Barbara was escorted back into the room. She looked exhausted, her usually impeccable appearance disheveled, but there was a glimmer of something in her eyes, determination, perhaps, or resolve. It's done, she said, her voice hoarse. The house and the offshore account, they're yours now. The shorter man, who I'd learned was called Mr. Dawson, nodded satisfaction. Excellent. Now, about locating your son. To my surprise, Barbara straightened her shoulders and fixed Mr. Dawson with a steely glare. No. That wasn't part of our agreement. You have the house and the money. Leave John out of this. Mr. Dawson's eyes narrowed dangerously. Mrs. Thompson, I don't think you understand the position you're in. We're not asking. It was at that moment that I found my voice, fueled by a sudden surge of anger and defiance. No, I don't think you understand. You've taken our home, our savings, everything. We have nothing left to give you, and we have no idea where John is. So unless you plan on kidnapping us, I suggest you take what you've gotten and leave. The room fell silent, tension thick in the air. Mr. Reeves and Mr. Dawson exchanged glances, seemingly taken aback by our united front. After what felt like an eternity, Mr. Dawson spoke. Very well. We'll be in touch if we need anything further. But remember, we'll be watching. If we find out you've been in contact with John. You won't, Barbara interrupted firmly. Because we have no way to contact him. Now, please leave our home. With final warning glares, the two men left, the sound of the front door closing echoing through the now empty house. As soon as they were gone, Barbara collapsed into a nearby chair, the strength that had carried her through the confrontation seemingly evaporating. I stood there, unsure of what to do or say, the events of the day swirling in my mind. "Sarah," Barbara said softly, breaking the silence. I don't even know where to begin. I'm so sorry. For everything." I sank into the chair opposite her, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle over me. "I don't understand, Barbara. How did it come to this? How could you and John keep all of this from me?" Barbara's eyes filled with tears. "It happened so gradually. At first, it was just a few bad investments. John was sure he could turn things around. Then the gambling started, and before we knew it, he was in over his head. He came to me, begging for help. I thought I could fix it. Protect him. Protect you. By lying to me. By trying to force me out of my own home." The hurt and anger in my voice were palpable. "I know it was wrong," Barbara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was desperate. I thought if I could get you away from here, away from the mess John had created, you'd be safe. I never imagined it would go this far." As I looked at Barbara, really looked at her, I saw not the formidable mother-in-law I'd always known, but a scared, heartbroken mother who had tried to protect her child, no matter the cost. "What do we do now?" I asked, the fight draining out of me. Barbara straightened in her chair, a hint of her usual determination returning. "Now, we fight back. Together." Her words took me by surprise. "Together? After everything that's happened?" She nodded firmly. "Yes, together. Sarah, I know I've hurt you, betrayed your trust. But right now, we're all we've got. And if we're going to get through this, we need each other." As much as part of me wanted to reject her offer, to hold on to my anger and hurt, I knew she was right. We were in this mess together, and we'd have to find a way out together. "Okay," I said slowly. "Where do we start?" Barbara's eyes lit up with a spark of hope. "First, we need legal help. I have a friend, a lawyer who specializes in financial crimes. He might be able to help us understand our options." I nodded, feeling a small surge of hope myself. "And then we start digging. There has to be a paper trail, something we can use to prove that John was manipulated, coerced. If we can show that these men deliberately trapped him in debt." As Barbara laid out her plan, I found myself listening with growing interest. Despite everything, I couldn't help but admire her resilience, her refusal to give up. Over the next few weeks, Barbara and I threw ourselves into the task of unraveling John's financial mess. We pored over bank statements, tracked down former colleagues, and pieced together a timeline of events that led to this disaster. It wasn't easy. There were days when the magnitude of what we'd lost threatened to overwhelm us. Nights when I lay awake, wondering how I could have been so blind to what was happening in my own marriage. But slowly, surely, we made progress. Our unlikely alliance grew stronger with each passing day. I found myself seeing a side of Barbara I'd never known existed, compassionate, determined, and fiercely loyal. She, in turn, seemed to develop a new respect for me, valuing my insights and resilience. As we worked, we also talked, really talked, for the first time. About John, about our fears and hopes, about the future we now faced. It was during one of these late-night conversations that Barbara made a confession that changed everything. "Sarah," she said, her voice hesitant. "There's something I need to tell you. Something about John." I braced myself, wondering what other secrets could possibly be left to uncover. Barbara took a deep breath. "The night before he disappeared, John called me. He was terrified. Said he'd discovered something big about the men he owed money to. He said if anything happened to him, I should look in the old family cabin. There's a hidden safe behind the fireplace." My heart raced at this new information. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "I was scared," Barbara admitted. "I thought if I said anything, it might put you in danger. But now I think it might be our only chance to clear John's name and get our lives back." The next morning, we set out for the family cabin, a place I'd visited only once early in my marriage to John. As we drove, I couldn't help but feel a mix of hope and trepidation. What would we find? And would it be enough to undo the damage that had been done? Arriving at the cabin, we wasted no time. Together, we moved the heavy stone facade of the fireplace, revealing a small safe built into the wall. With trembling hands, Barbara entered the combination. Inside, we found a USB drive and a thick folder of documents. As we began to go through the contents, our eyes widened in disbelief. John had uncovered evidence of a massive fraud scheme, one that implicated not just Mr. Reeves and Mr. Dawson, but high-ranking executives in several major corporations. "This is it," Barbara breathed, her voice filled with awe. "This is what John was trying to protect. With this, we can prove he was a victim, not a willing participant." As the implications of what we'd found sank in, I felt a surge of emotions: relief, vindication, and a renewed determination to fight for justice. Looking at Barbara, I saw my own feelings reflected in her eyes. In that moment, I realized that out of this nightmare, something unexpected had emerged, a bond between us, forged in adversity, stronger than I could have ever imagined. "What do we do now?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Barbara's smile was fierce and determined. "Now, my dear, we take this to the authorities. And then, we take our lives back." As we left the cabin, evidence in hand, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in weeks, I felt hope. Hope for justice, hope for redemption, and hope for a future I never could have anticipated. In the midst of betrayal and loss, I had found an unlikely ally in Barbara. Together, we would face whatever challenges lay ahead, united in our determination to uncover the truth and rebuild our lives. As we drove back to the city, I couldn't help but reflect on the strange twists of fate that had brought us to this point. Life, I realized, had a way of surprising you. Sometimes, it was the people you least expected who became your greatest allies in times of need. With Barbara by my side and the evidence safely in our possession, I felt ready to face whatever came next. The journey ahead would be difficult, but I was no longer alone. Together, we would find our way through this maze of deceit and emerge stronger on the other side.